Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar looking at the social acceptance of carbon capture and storage. I am Daryl, the Climate Energy Senior Manager at Ipieca. I'm pleased to welcome you all here today and would firstly like to share a special thanks to our partners, SPE CCUS Technical Section, SPE Gaia, OGCI and IOGP. Today's webinar will be moderated by Shannon, Ipieca's CCS Task Force Co-Chair, and before I pass over to him, I will just cover some housekeeping. So in terms of housekeeping, there'll be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, and to ask a question, please access the Q&A section and post questions there. Participants are unable to unmute or to turn their camera on unless the hosts enable permission. However, during the Q&A session, participants can also raise their hands to ask a question if they would like. Finally, the webinar will be recorded and the recording will be shared to registrants after the webinar has concluded. That's all from me for now, and I'll pass over to Shannon now to open the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daryl. And hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural Ipieca CCS webinar discussing social acceptance for CCS deployment in our current climate age. My name is Shannon Gray. I am one of the co-chairs at Ipieca for the CCS task force. My day job is working as a product development engineer for a company called 1.5. Which is based out of the United States, where we work at the intersection of climate and policy to figure out how to deploy large-scale carbon capture technologies to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Today, we have three excellent speakers, ranging from both a geographic and different scholarly backgrounds. I would like to introduce them to you now. Our first speaker for the webinar is going to be Laurent James. Laurent James is a consultant, researcher, and lecturer specializing in the energy transition with expertise in CCS, hydrogen technologies, and the social aspects of their deployment. He spent over 2 decades at Schlumberger in France and China, notably as marketing and technical director for the carbon services arm of those companies. Laurent co-founded Artis BEE, advising ENEA Consulting, and served as deputy director of the CNRS Earth and Universe Institute, also acting as France's industry liaison officer at the European Southern Observatory. He sits on several European research evaluation committees and lectures at universities and professional institutions in France, Europe, and Taiwan. Laurent holds degrees in engineering, nuclear physics, psychology, and philosophy, and is a member of SPE and Evelyn. Our second speaker for the webinar today will be Jasmin Sharzad. Jasmin Sharzad is the Chief Advisor at the Research and Subsurface section within the Danish Ministry of Climate, Energy, and Utilities. Her section is in charge of the Danish CCS regulations, supporting political decisions and creating the framework for the Danish CCS subsidy schemes. She holds a master's in international business and politics. Last but not least, we have Marino Varricchio. Marino Varricchio joined the European Roundtable for Climate Change and Sustainable Transition in August 2024 as a policy analyst, focusing on carbon management and sustainable fuels. Prior to this, he worked in the EU Affairs Advisor at ExxonMobil from 2021. His experience also includes research work at various centers and institutions, including the Marricactus Center, the American Institute for Economic Research, Luis University, and the Institute of Economic Affairs. He is co-chair of the European Commission's Working Group on the Public Perception of ICM Technologies. Since September 2024, he is also serving as the committee member and liaison representative at TC 474, or the Technical Committee on CO2 Capture, Transportation, Utilization, Storage, and Carbon Accounting. Each speaker will be giving a presentation roughly 10 to 12 minutes in length. After the 3 presentations, we will be having a Q&A session, approximately 25 minutes. With that, we can start the webinar. Lauren, whenever you're ready, please bring up your slides and we will dive in. Lauren, I think you are on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. Can you hear me now?
No worries.
And see my slides full screen? Okay, good. So
the slides are not full screen.
The slides are not full screen now. That's right. That should be okay.
Perfect.
Okay, good. So just before starting my presentation, I would like to mention that most of its content comes from the results of the GEFIS project, which stands for Social Governance for Subsurface Engineering Project, which I had the honor of co-leading. And I'm very grateful to all of my colleagues for their valuable contributions to this work. The implementation of underground engineering projects, CO2 storage, but not only, is raising more and more questions from civil society. As you all know, people have many concerns from nuisances due to operation to the risk of accidents and environmental damage, whether real or perceived, that could affect their daily lives. But the debate often goes beyond that. What's really being questioned by project stakeholders is the legitimacy of these technological choices, or even the very reason for a project to exist, especially when measured against the goals of the energy and ecological transition. So we just talked about stakeholders, but who are they? According to the Project Management Book of Knowledge Guide, a stakeholder is any person or group that may be affected by, or perceive itself as being affected by the project. In reality, stakeholders are highly diverse. They include individuals and organizations of different types, institutions, local communities, all with different relationships to the project. This diversity creates methodological difficulties. So how to identify them, how to map them, and how to avoid a static view, since stakeholders' positions often evolve over time, and even new stakeholders can declare themselves. So what exactly are stakeholders expecting today? Well, they are clearly asking for a much more active role, and this plays out in two main ways. First, they want to take part in the debate on the energy transition, not just in general terms, but in very concrete questions. For instance, what should be the regional or national contribution to the global effort? What technical solutions should be deployed locally? Are the projects being proposed really aligned with the existing plans? And importantly, what alternatives are being considered? At the heart of these questions is the issue of technology and project legitimacy. Second, stakeholders also want to be involved in the definition and governance of technology deployment, from the design phase right through to operation and closure. Here, their concerns are very practical. Can deployment be adapted to integrate smoothly into local territories? How can we make sure there is a positive return for the community? What are the risks and how will they be controlled? How will local nuisances or environmental degradation be compensated? And finally, can the decision-making process itself be shared? This set of questions is really about the quality of technology deployment and project execution. So overall, stakeholders are saying, don't just tell us what is going to happen, involve us in the debate, involve us in the decisions, and make us part of the governance process. So facing these issues, we often talk about social acceptability, but this concept is often seen as problematic and for good reason. Traditional approaches are focused on achieving social acceptability through proper communication for projects that were already predefined. And surprisingly, this approach has been widely criticized. Why? Because social acceptability is not a result. It's not a simple yes or no. Instead, it should be understood as a process that facilitates the implementation of a project while keeping discussions open without prejudging the final outcome. There are also two related concepts that often come up. The first is the social license to operate, but this is mainly a company-centric view. It removes the idea of process and reduces legitimacy to a kind of permission to operate. And the very notion of a license is problematic, as well as that of social. The second is free, prior, and informed consent, which comes from law and is strongly community focused. Today, though, it's becoming more and more process-oriented. But finally, let's be clear, simply addressing social acceptability through public perception studies is not enough, unless these studies lead to a passion of recommendations that change the way projects are implemented. They do not solve the problem. So meeting stakeholders' expectation really comes down to one key idea: engagement. So why? Because stakeholders are far more likely to support the ecological transition and the changes that comes with it if they are actively involved in defining and implementing those changes. In fact, when society faces necessary transformations, participatory democracy can actually strengthen representative democracy because it builds broader support and shared ownership of decisions. These insights are also consistent with what we know from social psychology, particularly the well-known commitment theory. People are more committed to outcomes when they have taken part in shaping them. So this is where the concept of social governance comes in. It's about debating and opening up certain decision-making processes to stakeholders using different engagement mechanisms so that decisions are not just made for people, but also with them. So in many public debates, everyone is brought in, often too late, and asked to discuss everything at once. The project, the technology, its maturity, its legitimacy, the national roadmap, and the local conditions for implementation. When all these issues get mixed together, disagreements often overlap, and very little progress is made. But if we look closer, these topics actually follow a natural order and need to be addressed step by step. For example, discussions on the conditions for carrying out a CO2 storage project in a specific territory can just happen if the technology has been identified in a national or regional planning document as a solution for carbon neutrality. So this is why we believe it's important to distinguish between debates about technologies or sectors and debates about specific projects. And we want to stress that discussions about technological options, which technologies are needed and in which context, must take place before discussions on the individual projects that will put them into practice. So then, with stakeholders' concerns in mind, we would like to advocate that debates on technologies happen in two stages. Again, first, the legitimacy of the technology itself, and then the conditions for its deployment. And we believe that responsibility for organizing these debates should lie with political authorities. So why? Because this prevents project developers from being accused of lobbying for the technologies they market. At this stage, they should be considered simply one stakeholder among others. So once the legitimacy of a technology has been established and its deployment plan has been discussed, it becomes much easier to move to the level of a specific project. And here again, we need to look at two things. First, the legitimacy of the project, and second, the conditions for its implementation. At this stage, the responsibility, of course, shifts to the project developer. So finally, we must remember that these debates happen at different scales. Following the distinction proposed by two Canadian researchers, Fortin and Fournis, we believe that debates about a technology or an industrial sector belong at the national and regional scales, and debate about a specific project should take place at the regional and local scale. So this slide goes into more detail and shows how we suggest engaging stakeholders during the preliminary discussions on the technology and its deployment plan. Here you can see a list of different topics that are of interest to a wide range of stakeholders. For each of these, we propose different levels of engagement, starting with lighter forms, such as informing and consulting, and moving towards more active approaches like collaboration and joint decision-making. The key idea is simple. On the most important topics for stakeholders, they should not only be heard, but also be able to contribute directly, shaping the definition of plans and the modalities of implementation. But by following this structured approach, we can strengthen buy-in, reduce resistances, and make sure that deployment is not only technically sound, but also broadly supported across society. So this, and now let's look at how stakeholder engagement evolves once we move into the implementation of a project. Again, the goal is not just to keep stakeholders informed, but to actively involve them, especially in monitoring progresses and addressing challenges as they come up. Regular communication is essential here, whether through progress updates, steering committee meetings, but also targeted consultations, workshops on specific issues, and sometimes joint decisions. And once again, the key first step is to confirm the legitimacy of the project before moving on to its implementation with specific engagement moments in the different phases. So this approach helps maintain alignment with stakeholder expectations, ensure transparency, and builds trust throughout the process by involving them actively. In turn, it reduces resistance, allows to identify risk earlier, and makes stakeholders feel a genuine sense of ownership over the outcomes. So again, these slides provides more detail on the topics where engagement is needed, and for each of them, specific level of engagement. Here again, the idea is to ensure that stakeholders are not only kept informed, but also engaged at the right depths, depending on the issue. For some areas, a lighter level of engagement, such as regular updates, may be sufficient, while for others, we may need closer collaboration or even joint decision-making. By tailoring the level of engagement to each topic, we make the process both efficient and meaningful. So this approach helps us secure buy-in, maintain alignment, and avoid the fatigue that can come from involving stakeholders too much or too little in areas that matter differently to them. So to conclude, social acceptability, or more simply acceptance, should not be only seen as unexpected results. It's much better understood as the outcome of a collaborative process that involves all stakeholders, including project developers. In this process, stakeholders come together to discuss and decide on the legitimacy of a technology or a project in a given territory, making sure it serves the common good. They also work to define the necessary conditions so that technology deployment and project implementation happen smoothly in a way that respects both the natural environment and local communities. It is far more effective to approach this as a process of stakeholder engagement rather than just a target or a result. So the success of such a process will still depend on several key factors: a clear hierarchy of debates, strong attention to contextual and environmental considerations, active and continuous stakeholder participation, and finally, the ability to maintain the conditions for social acceptability throughout the entire project lifecycle. And I am done with my presentation. Thanks a lot to everybody for listening.
Thank you, Laurent, for the excellent presentation. Next up, we have Jasmin. Jasmin, could you please share your screen and bring up your slides? If you have any questions for Laurent, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll be taking them in the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. Jasmin, whenever you're ready.
Yes. Thank you very much. And please also, if you need to interrupt me or anything, just do it, because I'm not sure I can see your see the screen. No, I could actually. Okay, no problem. I hope you can see my slides and that they're in full screen.
Full screen.
Yes.
You're good to go.
Excellent. Good to go. Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me. My name is Jasmin, and I'm the Deputy Head of Subsurface and Research here at the Danish Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utilities. I'm going to run through, first of all, sort of the Danish history and, the progress we've had with the CCS. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about social acceptance. So if I just start basically from the beginning, when CCS actually became a thing in Denmark. So what happened was that back in 2019, we had a climate election here in Denmark. And the current government at that time, together with their supporting parties, they set, and a lot of other political parties in parliament, they set a 70% reduction target by 2030. And that became crucial to basically the climate policy since then. What happened in practice was that an ambitious target was set, and then basically we had to figure out how to reach it. And within that catalog of different opportunities, CCS was highlighted as a technology that could be used not only for 2030, but also for 2040, 2050, and going beyond. So that's just quite important for me to start there. Then, since that ambitious climate target was set, CCS really took off in Denmark. There is generally broad political support for CCS as a climate tool. When we made the first CCS agreement, there was 11 out of 13 parties in parliament from left to right that supported it. And since then, we've made 10 political agreements in less than 5 years. And again, they are all from left to right. So basically, we have quite a strong political mandate, and which is not going to be subject to changing government or the likes. So one thing is setting political goals, having ambitions, and making agreements. But with that, money also followed. So 3 national subsidy schemes were created. And here it says 39 billion DKK. So I think the equivalent is around 5 billion euros, just to give you an idea. And the first subsidy scheme, when we had that, it was reverted to a project which ERCST was in charge of. That project, it's going to be fully operating and fully capturing in 2026, and they are well on track to reach that goal. The second subsidy scheme we had was targeted towards biogenic emissions. And now the third, which we're concluding, the best and final offer has to be handed in by the end of this year. So it will be exciting to see who wins. There's currently 8 companies who have made an indicative offer to the Danish Energy Agency. So let's see what happens within the coming months. On the storage side, we the Danish Energy Agency has awarded 7 exploration licenses, and that's actually both for storage onshore and offshore. While developing our national framework, we're also very much aware that in order to get down in price, you need to get up in scale. And to do that, we need to look towards Europe. So we have currently 5 bilateral arrangements with Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Norway, and Sweden to allow the import and export of CO2 with the purpose of storage. And since these slides are going to be made available afterwards, I am not going to dig deep into the different sites, but this is just to illustrate the activities where they're located in our country, both onshore and offshore. So now to the topic that I was actually given the floor to say a little bit more about. Maybe I should also say that I've basically been here since the beginning. I started in the ministry back in 2019, actually, right before that ambitious climate target was set. So I've been there when we had to build sort of our CCS capabilities also within the civil service. We went from basically having a couple of geologists who knew something about the subsurface to now having 11 dedicated people within our ministry, more than 25 dedicated people in our energy agency, and a bunch of more geologists in our geological institution. And I mentioned this because in terms of particularly the onshore storage development, it has really been a collaboration. Once we decided that we wanted to open up for onshore storage, what was done was to look at regulation, but then also public and social acceptance. And even before talking about projects or awarding licenses, we had a huge round of analysis and dialogue with local stakeholders, municipalities, and so on, basically to hear what they thought about CCS, what some of their worries might be, etc. So that was both done on a sort of regional government, municipal government level, and then with the actual citizens during town hall meetings. And that continues, sort of that dialogue, it's ongoing. And now that licenses have been awarded, it's actually within the mandate of that license holder, and it's part of the license to continuously keep neighbors and interested parties updated on the tasks and activities going on. So one thing that we learned from the specific activities with it, which is within the realm of state agencies. Here, this is a photo from our geological institution's seismic data gathering campaign, where they went out with some trucks, kilometers of data gathering. But in practice, it was really meeting the citizens, showing up in person, having a coffee with them, being available to answering, questions, both very technical ones, but also quite specific ones. I remember I was part of some of these activities, and citizens have questions ranging from, how is this going to affect my house price? How is this going to affect the water? Is there going to be contamination, et cetera, et cetera? So just to say that there's many levels where you can meet people, and also many outlets. I mean, it's one thing being there in person on the field, but also social media, newspapers, television interviews, and so on, has also been something that that has worked in terms of getting the message out there. Here, I've just gathered a bunch of some of the concerns and questions raised, which we saw really across the country. There tends to be sometimes a little bit of a city versus countryside debate, worries about contamination that has perhaps nothing to do with CCS in itself, but maybe experiences from other big projects. Concerns about leaks, housing prices, as I mentioned before, but then also a spillover to, well, who are the companies actually who actually have to deal with this? And it's interesting that, Laurent, you mentioned in your presentation that you should discuss the technology before you discuss specific projects. And we actually did that. But we had also the experience that sometimes it became maybe a little bit too abstract for people. They wanted to talk more about specific projects, where the well's going to be located, and so on. And of course, at that stage of the public consultation, we could not engage in such talks on a very specific level, but it's just an interesting point that we saw. Yeah. And then, of course, also locals. I mean, the local support, what is the local community getting out of it? That's also something that is usually raised, which we saw across the country. So to sum it up, some of my main takeaways from the Danish experience, I think we have been quite successful because we started out with really a broad political mandate on a state level, clear political targets, but also talking more about this as an activity in terms of reaching climate goals. And that has been quite important, I think, for this widespread support. The way we also work with this is, it's one thing to be present at local communities, having an open mind, constantly being there, but there's also something to coordinating between other public authorities, It's not just us, our ministry and our agencies. There are many other levels and layers to this. And then, of course, also industry are quite vital in this. And then what we saw as some of our takeaways is that, well, skepticism towards CCS, from what we have experienced, it might not be driven specifically by the technology itself. People have other concerns and legitimate concerns about how it affects them on various parameters. And also what we experienced is that we have a saying in Danish, like you should meet people in eye height, like don't try to make this overcomplicated, talking very technical terms. Try to, talk more about the things that could be relevant for citizens in the area, and do as much as you can with the current knowledge. There's sometimes a lot of stuff that you can't say with certainty, but you can start from there. And of course, it's also quite important to address this point about local benefits if you're going to a local community. So that would be sort of my takeaway points to anyone who wants to try and do this within their country. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
That was it
Thank
for
you,
me.
Jasmin. Thank you so much for that overview. And we've gotten a few questions in the chat specific to your experience in Denmark. So I'm looking forward to help moderating those. Marino, I see you are on camera. Are you ready?
Yes, I am. I'm sharing my screen.
Okay. I can see it, and you're presenting. Take it away.
Fine, thank you very much. I will deal with the issue of social acceptance of CCS in the EU from probably a slightly more theoretical perspective, academic, if you want. At the end of my presentation, I have touched reference list for those of you who are just curious and want to know more about the topic. First thing first, just a little bit of introduction. As I think every one of you know, CCS is a critical technology and is known to be extremely important for reaching EU climate goals and global climate goals. This strategic importance is now recognized by pretty much every reputable climate scenario and every reputable climate projection, including those, for example, of the IPCC and the IEA. The EU climate goals, in order to be reached, will need to include considerable support for CCS deployment. Unfortunately, technical adequacy and economic development per se are not success guarantees. And indeed, this is where the social dimension of the CCS, the acceptance, the public accepted dimension steps in, and is becoming ever important. Essentially, social acceptance operates across three key dimensions, or as we can model them, three actors: the socio-political actors, for example, NGOs and policymakers or academia, the community, and specifically local residents and the authorities that are in touch with concrete developments of CCS project, and of course, market. The level of interaction between these three actors and the successfulness of such interaction determines whether a CCS project will be socially accepted or not. There are several frameworks that have tried to model and understand the social dimension of acceptance. The Bauti method or the SEL, the social embeddedness level, that basically try to model the actor and then translate the risk of social rejections into governance strategies that can mitigate such a risk, which is one of the determinants of the success of a given carbon management project. And by carbon management, I don't just mean CCS, I also mean CCU or CDR, for example. As I said, there are these three actors: the socio-political dimension, the community dimension, and the market dimensions. Of course, each one of these dimensions is a set of actors, and each of these actors has certain concerns that determine, again, the level of social acceptance for CCS technologies. For example, typically policymakers and NGOs, their main focus is on climate effectiveness, policy credibility, and in general, distributional consequences of a given carbon management project. On the other side, the municipal authorities and local residents really have high on their agenda safety risks, the impact of CCS on property values, and the local impact, the local environmental impact. And of course, there are regulatory and market considerations that market actors typically prioritize. It's very important to keep these three dimensions separated, because most of the time, even at the policy level, social acceptance of CCS is just implied to represent citizens' concerns or resident concerns, while the question is more, I think, nuanced and complex than that. Basically, there are several risks that may refrain a certain project from being universally accepted or from reaching an acceptable level of tolerance, let's put it this way. One of these is for sure the so-called leakage risk, the NIMBY phenomenon, or the perception of CCS as a fossil fuel perpetuation strategy. These, I would say, are the three main risks that have to do with safety and environment. And to recognize these risks does not mean to accept them. It does not mean to think that they are valid, because literature and real-world data universally confirm that the leakage risk is almost negligible, and it's not difficult to demonstrate that CCS is a very valuable solution beyond any concern of perpetuation of fossil fuel use. But again, these are risks that residents, communities, and even policy actors have high on their agenda, and may refrain the public and may refrain the community from accepting a given carbon management project. Of course, there are also sociopolitical and regulatory risks. For example, a lack of a cohesive and consistent regulatory framework, or the excessive use of top-down approaches that risk ignoring communities' concerns. In terms, of course, of economic and distributional risks or concern, there are, again, concerns related to the economic lock-in effects for fossil fuels intensive industries. These risks is more technical, but is clearly related to the perpetuation of fossil fuel use argument, and the perception of CCS as a costly technology diverting resources from renewable energy. This, of course, is some of these risks are based, or maybe all of them, are based on a lack of understanding of what CCS is, on what hard-to-abate industries are, and how fossil fuel industry operate, and the benefits they generate, and the benefits that carbon management technologies deliver. In terms of risk mitigation strategies, together with the European Commission, we did a lot of work to isolate and study the best engagement strategies that may contribute to a higher level of social acceptance. Of course, proactive engagement of the community is definitely the main, probably, solution for having local residents and communities understand what CCS projects are all about and the benefit they may provide. And this is being indeed increasingly recognized at the EU level. For example, in the Innovation Fund, the SANIA, for 2025, there is a knowledge in the funding voices of the document. There is the creation of a shared knowledge platform for industrial carbon management technologies, something that I, together with the other two co-chairs of the European Commission Working Group on Public Acceptance, put in the official document as strategies for keeping the public engaged and allowing CCS project actors to share the best practices for building community consensus. Let's put it this way. Of course, as it was highlighted in the previous, the presentation before mine, transparent communication and education are absolutely essential. Communicating the risk, communicating the benefits, and communicating the feature of the project in a plain, clear language is absolutely key in order for such project to be accepted. When it comes down to the technical side of it, it's also essential to have the correct regulatory landscape in place. Otherwise, it's unlikely that market actors and policy actors will accept CCS project. Regulations have to be stringent, but also easy to understand, and they have to set universal, broad rules instead of cherry-picking directives that may limit the growth and the climate benefit and the economic benefit, the non-climate benefit that carbon management projects may deliver. And by regulatory landscape, I refer to both regulation and financial mechanisms, of course. These are just some examples of what we have in the EU. We have, in terms of CCS, a rather clear regulatory framework that lies at the intersection of the EU CCS directive and the EU ETS. Of course, there are some supplementary legal instruments that contribute to regulate CCS and the required CO2 infrastructure. In terms, again, of mitigation strategies for social risks, it's essential to have early and continuous community engagement, to inform the community about the distributional consequences of project by setting up equitable benefit sharing mechanisms, and of course, having a clear framework on independent monitoring and verification to enhance public trust in the very projects that we want to be upscaled. There are, again, case studies that can lie that actually are example of both success and failure of CCS project due to perhaps firm public opposition despite government support, which shows, for example, in the case of the Barendrecht cancellation, that having the correct regulatory framework is for sure necessary, but by no means sufficient in order for a given project to be approved. Again, it's as I try to condense in few slides, social acceptance is a multivariate problems. There are proactive strategies that can be put in place. No universal solution exists, and tailored approaches are absolutely necessary in order for a given project to be socially accepted. some further studies are needed in terms of comparative analysis and methodological framework, but the integration of social acceptance consideration in the very planning process is a fundamental prerequisite for having successful carbon management technologies projects. These are some references, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marino. That was an excellent overview, an excellent framework for how to think about CCS and expand that into social kind of norms and regulations as we move forward. Okay, thank you to all my presenters. I'm going to ask my presenters to come back on camera, and we are going to kick off the Q&A. I've been populating questions as we go. I'm going to try and take not my own questions, but those from the audience. I also see a few hands. We're going to do questions first and then hands. But if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A section. I think Daryl's been scraping them from the chat and kind of putting them over, but that's where I'll be pulling them. So if I miss your question, I apologize in advance, but we do have limited time. Okay, we'll jump right into the Q&A. The first one I think is a question for Laurent and Jasmin. It's from Derek Carlton. Says, Laurent, it is likely that the additional stakeholders become involved once reaching the local project stage, and they have not been involved in earlier stages such as acceptance of a CCS technology. The risk then is that there are delays as they need to be conceived of the they need to be convinced of the legitimacy of the technology. Do you have recommendations of how to deal with this difficulty? And so looking at first, explaining the technology versus the project. Jasmin, I think you also touched on this lightly. Laurent, I'd throw that question to you. Laurent, I think you're still on mute. Can you hear me okay?
Laurent, I think you're still on mute.
Yes. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes. Perfect. Sorry. Can you rephrase the question? It was I was not able to pick it up.
No worries. Generally, the question is, how do you overcome the potential barriers of getting buy-in on a CCS technology before necessarily talking about the project? If I'm summarizing that correctly, I think there's this distinction between, if someone is against CCS as a technology, how do you then start that conversation from the get-go?
Yeah. Okay. No. First of all, I mean, you have to recognize that I would say national and regional level that CCS is a technology that is needed, and in France we see that because we have energy transition scenarios, and for each of the scenarios we position this kind of CO2 emission abatement technologies. So whether for some of them we have to acknowledge that CO2 storage is needed. But what stakeholders at this stage want to discuss is alternatives. So if you talk about storage, of course, they will raise the question of utilization. So you have to discuss storage versus utilization. And they may also want to discuss, if natural-based solutions are possibilities to replace storage. So at the very upfront, depending on for each of the energy transition scenarios, you have to be able to discuss the relative merit and needs for each technologies that will contribute to emission abatement. And in France, it's clear that we need the technology because we have non-abatable emissions from the industry, essentially cement and steel manufacturing industry. So when you are able to show that,